Growing up, I always knew I wasn't the favorite. My older sister, Emily, had that title locked down before I was even old enough to understand what favoritism meant. It wasn't just subtle little things. It was glaring, impossible to ignore bias that followed me everywhere. Emily was the miracle baby, as my mom called her. After struggling to conceive, my parents had her, and they poured every ounce of their attention, pride, and love into her. I came along 2 years later, a surprise they hadn't planned for, and it always felt like I was treated as just that, a surprise they didn't quite know what to do with. Birthdays were a perfect example. While most kids look forward to their special day, I dreaded mine because I knew it wouldn't actually feel like mine. Every year, the cake would be Emily's favorite flavor, chocolate with raspberry filling. I hated raspberry, and I told my parents that every year, but my mom would brush it off, saying, "It's not about the flavor. It's about being together as a family." Meanwhile, Emily would smugly cut herself the biggest slice. She always found a way to make every occasion about her. Family vacations? Same story. If we were going to the beach, it was because Emily wanted to. If I suggested something else, like going to an amusement park, I'd get the same response every time. "Emily's older. She gets to choose." It didn't matter if it was my birthday, my celebration, or just a casual day. Emily's wants always came first, and if I ever dared to complain, I'd be accused of being selfish or ungrateful. At first, I thought Emily didn't notice how unfair it all was. She mostly ignored me when we were kids, treating me like a piece of furniture in her perfectly curated life. But things shifted when we hit middle school. That's when Emily started losing friends. I'm not sure if they got tired of her bossy, self-centered nature or if she pushed them away, but by the time she hit 8th grade, she was spending most of her time alone. At first, I felt sorry for her. I knew how it felt to be ignored, after all. But pity turned into resentment when she made me her personal scapegoat for everything wrong in her life. If Emily couldn't have friends, I couldn't either. She started accusing my friends of stealing things whenever they came over, making them uncomfortable enough that they stopped visiting. When I asked my parents why they didn't defend me, my mom just said, "Emily's going through a rough time. Maybe focus on spending more family time with her instead of running off with your friends." It didn't stop there. Emily began telling my parents I was sneaking out at night or talking to boys I shouldn't be. None of it was true, but my parents always believed her. I spent most of high school grounded for things I didn't even do. The worst part was that Emily didn't even hide her lies. She'd smirk at me across the dinner table while my parents lectured me about responsibility. Once, when I confronted her in private, she just laughed and said, "It's not my fault they believe me. Maybe you should try being more convincing." I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Yelling wouldn't change anything. It never did. My saving grace was our extended family. My cousins and I were close, and they weren't blind to what was happening. During one family gathering, my cousin Maddie invited me to a sleepover at her house. I told her I couldn't go because my parents wouldn't allow it. When she asked why, I blurted out, "Because Emily doesn't have any friends, and I'm not allowed to have any either." The room went silent. My aunt overheard and immediately pulled my mom aside. I don't know what was said, but I remember my mom storming back into the room, her face red with anger. That night, I got grounded for lying about Emily, but something must have sunk in because, after that, my parents started giving me a little more freedom. Not much, but enough that I could breathe without Emily constantly hovering over me. Of course, Emily didn't take that well. She demanded to switch schools the next year, claiming she needed a fresh start. My parents immediately agreed, even though it meant driving her 30 minutes each way and paying more for tuition. At her new school, she found a new group of friends, but that didn't mean she left me alone. If anything, it made her worse. She'd bring her friends over to our house, and they'd mock me to my face while my parents brushed it off as teasing. I stopped inviting anyone over. It was easier to be lonely than to subject my friends to Emily's games. By the time I got to high school, I'd learned to keep my head down. My parents were too busy catering to Emily to notice me most of the time, which was a blessing in disguise. I buried myself in my schoolwork, knowing that good grades were my ticket out. I didn't expect my parents to help with college. I'd overheard too many conversations about how expensive Emily's private school was. But I knew if I worked hard enough, I could earn a scholarship and finally escape. Emily's world, on the other hand, was starting to crack. She brought home her first boyfriend during my sophomore year, and my parents were ecstatic. They constantly compared me to her, saying things like, "Why can't you find someone like Emily's boyfriend?" But a few months later, he broke up with her, and the narrative shifted. Suddenly, he was a manipulative jerk who had tricked her, and my parents acted like the breakup was some great betrayal against our family. Meanwhile, I had started secretly dating a guy from my math class, Jake. I didn't dare bring him home. I knew what would happen if Emily got wind of it, but somehow, she found out anyway. One day, Jake pulled me aside after school, looking uncomfortable. "Your sister was waiting for me in the parking lot," he said. "She tried to flirt with me, and when I didn't respond, she told me I was disgusting for dating you." I was furious, but what could I do? If I told my parents, they'd believe her version of the story, not mine. Sure enough, when Jake stopped coming around, Emily wasted no time spreading rumors that he'd broken up with me because I was too clingy. My parents nodded sympathetically and told me I needed to be more like Emily, independent and mature. That was when I realized I couldn't wait for things to get better. If I wanted a future, I'd have to fight for it myself. By the time senior year rolled around, I was in full survival mode. My focus was on keeping my head down, acing my classes, and doing whatever it took to get out of that house. Emily, meanwhile, was basking in the attention of her new friend group. She'd settled into her role as the queen bee at her school, and my parents couldn't have been prouder. They'd brag about her endlessly, her social life, her extracurriculars, her leadership skills. What they didn't talk about were her grades, which were average at best. Anytime she brought home a C, it was celebrated like a major achievement. Meanwhile, I brought home straight A's and never heard so much as a good job. One night, I decided to test the waters. "I got a 100 on my AP English exam," I said during dinner, trying to sound casual. My dad didn't even look up from his plate. "That's what we expect from you," he said. "You've always been good at school." Emily smirked at me across the table, and I clenched my fists under the napkin in my lap. It wasn't just the lack of praise that hurt. It was the fact that they didn't even pretend to care. I excused myself early, went upstairs, and opened my laptop. That night, I started applying for every scholarship I could find. If they weren't going to help me, fine. I didn't need them. The day I got my first scholarship offer was the first time I'd felt hope in years. It wasn't much, just a few $1,000s, but it was enough to make me believe that getting out was possible. I threw myself into more applications, staying up late into the night researching programs and writing essays. By the time graduation rolled around, I'd secured a full ride to a solid state university. It wasn't an Ivy League school, but it was good enough. When I got the acceptance letter, I couldn't help but feel a small spark of pride. I wanted to scream it from the rooftops, but I knew better. If I told my parents right away, Emily would find a way to ruin it. So, I waited until I had everything in writing and then announced it on social media. I posted a photo of the acceptance letter with a caption thanking my teachers, friends, and extended family for their support. The response was overwhelming. My cousins and aunts flooded the comments with congratulations, and even a few of Emily's old friends liked the post. My parents, however, weren't nearly as enthusiastic. When I came downstairs that evening, my mom's face was tight. "You should have told us first," she said. "It's embarrassing that we had to find out online." I bit back the urge to laugh. Embarrassing for who? I wanted to ask. Instead, I shrugged and said, "I figured you'd want to wait until Emily finished school before worrying about me." That shut her up. Emily, of course, wasn't happy either. "Why are you making such a big deal out of it?" she said the next day, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's not like you got into Harvard or anything." I didn't bother responding. Her jealousy was obvious, and I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing she'd gotten under my skin. But her words stuck with me longer than I wanted to admit. Even with the scholarship, I couldn't help feeling like I wasn't doing enough, like I had to prove that I deserved my spot at the table. The summer before I left for college was one of the longest of my life. My parents kept finding excuses to drag me into family obligations, claiming it was important to spend time together before you leave. In reality, It felt like a thinly veiled attempt to make me second-guess my decision. My mom would say things like, "It's so far away. What if you get homesick?" Or, "Emily thinks you're going to struggle with the workload." My dad added his own jabs, saying, "You're not as street smart as your sister. College can be tough for people like you." I ignored them as best I could, but the constant negativity wore me down. By the time move-in day arrived, I was ready to pack my bags and run out the door. My parents came with me, of course, but the whole trip felt more like a funeral procession than a celebration. My mom kept pointing out random dangers on campus. "Don't walk alone at night, and make sure you lock your doors," while my dad grumbled about how much gas they'd used for the drive. Emily stayed home, claiming she was too busy to come, which I was secretly grateful for. When they finally left, I sat on the edge of my dorm bed, staring out the window at the unfamiliar skyline. For the first time in my life, I was truly alone. It was terrifying, but it was also liberating. I didn't have to worry about Emily barging into my room or my parents dismissing my achievements. This was my chance to start fresh, and I wasn't going to waste it. College turned out to be everything I'd hoped for. I made friends who didn't care about my family drama, professors who noticed my hard work, and a routine that gave me structure and purpose. For the first time, I felt like I had control over my own life. I called my parents occasionally, out of a sense of obligation, but I kept the conversation short and avoided giving them too many details. It wasn't until Thanksgiving break that I realized just how much things had changed. When I came home, Emily was still living there, having dropped out of college after just 2 years. She spent most of her time on the couch, scrolling through her phone and complaining about her job at the same office where my mom worked. My parents had pulled strings to get her hired, of course, and they acted like it was a huge favor. "Your sister is building her future," my mom said during dinner one night, ignoring the fact that Emily wasn't paying rent or contributing to household expenses. I didn't say anything, but I couldn't help feeling a pang of satisfaction. For once, I wasn't the one being treated like a failure. Thanksgiving break was my first real taste of how much had shifted since I left. Emily's smug superiority was still there, but it had cracked just enough for me to notice. She barely spoke to me during dinner, opting instead to scroll through her phone or make snide comments about my college. "Must be nice not having to work a real job," she said at one point, not even looking up. My dad gave a half-hearted chuckle, but my mom quickly changed the subject, clearly trying to avoid another argument. I didn't rise to the bait. I had spent years biting my tongue around Emily, and I wasn't about to change that now. But it was hard not to notice how different things felt. Emily wasn't the confident, untouchable golden child she used to be. She looked tired, and there was a bitterness in her tone that hadn't been there before. My parents still favored her, of course. They always would. But even they seemed a little weary of her constant demands. The real bombshell came on the second night of my visit. My mom cornered me in the kitchen while I was making tea, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Your sister's been having a tough time," she said, glancing toward the living room to make sure Emily couldn't hear. "She's not happy at work, and we're worried about her." I raised an eyebrow, unsure where this was going. "Okay," I said cautiously. "And what does that have to do with me?" My mom hesitated, wringing her hands like she was bracing herself for something. "We were thinking, maybe you could talk to her. You've always been more grounded, more focused. Maybe you could give her some advice, help her get back on track." I nearly laughed out loud. The idea of me giving advice to Emily, the sister who had spent years tearing me down, was so absurd I didn't even know how to respond. Instead, I took a slow sip of my tea and said, "I think Emily would hate that. She's never exactly been interested in my opinion." My mom frowned, clearly unsatisfied with my answer, but she didn't push it further. Still, the conversation stuck with me. For years, I'd been the forgotten child, the one who was never quite good enough. Now, suddenly, my parents wanted me to swoop in and fix their golden child's mess? It was almost laughable. Almost. By the time I returned to campus, I'd made up my mind to keep my distance. I wasn't going to let my family drag me back into their dysfunction. College was my escape, and I intended to make the most of it. Over the next few months, I threw myself into my studies, joined a few clubs, and even started dating someone. A guy named Nate who was kind, funny, and completely unlike anyone I'd met back home. For the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely happy. But my family wasn't ready to let me go so easily. The calls from my mom became more frequent, each one laced with thinly veiled guilt trips. "Your sister misses you," she said during one conversation. "You should come home more often. It's not fair to Emily that you're always so busy." Another time, she mentioned that Emily was thinking about going back to school, but she needed a little guidance to figure out her next steps. I knew better than to fall for it. Emily didn't need guidance. She needed someone to do the work for her. And my mom, as always, was ready to bend over backward to make that happen. Things came to a head during spring break. I hadn't planned on going home, but my dad called me out of the blue, his tone uncharacteristically serious. "Your mom's been upset lately," he said. "It would mean a lot if you came back for a few days." Against my better judgment, I agreed. When I arrived, the tension in the house was palpable. Emily barely acknowledged me, and my parents seemed to be walking on eggshells. I quickly realized why when my mom pulled me aside on my second day there. "We have a favor to ask," she said, her voice low. "Emily's been struggling financially, and we were hoping you could help her out." I stared at her, completely dumbfounded. "Help her out how?" I asked. "Well, you've been saving up with all those scholarships," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Maybe you could lend her some money, just until she gets back on her feet." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You want me to give Emily my scholarship money?" I asked, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. My mom winced, glancing toward the living room as if she was worried Emily might overhear. "Not all of it," she said quickly, "just enough to help her get through the next few months. She's your sister, and family helps each other." I shook my head, my hands trembling with anger. "Family helps each other?" I repeated. "Is that what you call everything you've done for Emily over the years? Helping her while you ignored me?" My mom tried to backtrack, but I wasn't having it. I told her, in no uncertain terms, that my money was off limits. If Emily needed financial help, she could ask our parents, just like she always had. I didn't owe her anything, and I wasn't going to sacrifice my future to clean up her mess. The rest of the visit was tense, to say the least. My dad tried to smooth things over, but even he couldn't pretend everything was fine. When I left, I didn't bother saying goodbye to Emily. She barely looked up from her phone as I walked out the door. On the drive back to campus, I felt a mix of anger and relief. Anger at my parents for once again prioritizing Emily's needs over mine, but relief that I'd finally stood up for myself. For the first time, I didn't let them guilt me into giving more than I had to give. And that, I realized, was a small victory in itself. After spring break, I threw myself back into my life at college, determined not to let my family's latest stunt drag me down. I wasn't surprised by their audacity anymore. At this point, I'd come to expect it. But what stuck with me was the realization that I didn't feel guilty for standing up to them. For the first time, I said no, and the world didn't end. It was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. That summer, I decided to stay on campus and take on an internship rather than go home. It was a practical choice. I needed the experience, and the stipend was enough to cover my living expenses. But deep down, I knew the real reason was to avoid another confrontation with my family. I told my parents about the internship in a short phone call, framing it as a necessary step for my career. My mom sounded vaguely disappointed, but she didn't argue. I suspected she knew I wouldn't budge. Of course, Emily didn't take the news as gracefully. She sent me a series of passive-aggressive texts, accusing me of abandoning the family. "It's not fair that you get to run off and do whatever you want while mom and dad are stuck helping me," one of her messages read. "They're stressed because of you, you know?" I didn't respond. I had no interest in engaging with her anymore. The internship turned out to be one of the best decisions I'd ever made. The work was challenging but rewarding, and for the first time, I felt like I was building something for myself. My coworkers were supportive. My supervisor encouraged me to take on new responsibilities, and I finally started to see a path for my future that didn't involve looking over my shoulder at what Emily or my parents thought. By the time the fall semester started, I felt like a different person, more confident, more independent. I had a plan for my life, and I wasn't going to let anyone derail it. So when I got a call from my mom 2 weeks into the semester, I was ready for whatever guilt trip she had prepared. She didn't disappoint. "Your dad and I are really worried about Emily," she said after a few minutes of small talk. "She's been feeling really down lately, and we think it would help if you came home for a weekend. She misses you." I almost laughed. Emily missed me? That was a new one. "I'm really busy with classes and work," I said, keeping my tone polite but firm. "Maybe over winter break." My mom sighed, clearly annoyed by my response. "We just think it would be good for her to spend some time with you. She looks up to you, even if she doesn't show it." The irony of that statement hit me so hard I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Emily had spent years tearing me down, and now, suddenly, I was supposed to believe she looked up to me? It was almost impressive how far my mom was willing to stretch the truth to get me to come home. "I'll think about it," I said, knowing full well I wouldn't. After that, the calls became less frequent. I wasn't sure if my mom had finally given up, or if she was just waiting for the next opportunity to reel me back in. Either way, I appreciated the peace and quiet. I focused on my studies, spent time with Nate, and started applying for jobs in my field. For the first time, I felt like I was truly moving forward. Then, out of the blue, I got a text from Emily. It wasn't her usual passive-aggressive nonsense. It was an actual apology. "Hey," she wrote, "I know we've had our differences, but I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how I've treated you. I've been thinking about things a lot, and I know I haven't been a good sister." I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe her, to think that maybe she'd finally seen the light. But another part of me, the part that had spent years being manipulated and lied to, wasn't so sure. I decided to keep it simple. "Thanks for saying that," I replied. "I hope you're doing okay." Her response came almost immediately. "I'm trying. It's been hard, but I'm working on myself." I didn't know what to make of it. Was this genuine? Or was it just another ploy to pull me back into the family drama? I decided to keep my guard up, at least for now. Over the next few weeks, Emily kept texting me, slowly chipping away at the wall I'd built between us. Her messages were friendly, even supportive at times. She asked about my classes, my internship, and Nate. She never brought up the past or asked for anything, which was a refreshing change. I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was serious about trying to repair our relationship. But then came the catch. One evening, she called me for the first time in years. Her voice was hesitant, almost nervous. "I need to ask you something," she said. Here it was. The real reason for her sudden interest in my life. "What is it?" I asked, bracing myself. "Well, I've been thinking about going back to school," she said. "But it's expensive, and Mom and Dad can't help right now. I was wondering if you could, maybe loan me some money? Just until I get back on my feet." There it was. The old Emily, right on schedule. I should have known. "I can't do that," I said, keeping my tone firm but calm. "I've worked hard for what I have, and I need to focus on my own future." She didn't take it well. "Wow," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've really changed, haven't you? I thought family was supposed to help each other." "Family doesn't mean putting yourself last," I said. "You've had plenty of help, Emily. It's time to figure things out on your own." The call ended on a sour note, and I knew I just burned whatever fragile bridge we'd been building. But I didn't regret it. I'd spent too many years being used, and I wasn't going back to that. When I told Nate about the conversation later that night, he just shook his head. "She's never going to change," he said. "And honestly, that's not your problem anymore." He was right. It wasn't my problem. For the first time, I felt like I was finally free. After that phone call with Emily, I thought the drama would die down. I'd said my piece, set my boundaries, and moved on. But if there was one thing I should have known by now, it was that my family didn't take no for an answer. A week later, my mom called. Her voice was tight, like she was trying to sound calm but was barely holding it together. "Emily told me what you said," she began. "She's really hurt, She's been through a lot, and we were hoping you'd be more understanding." I sighed, gripping the phone tighter. "Mom, I'm not giving Emily money. I've worked hard to get where I am, and I can't just hand that over because she refuses to take responsibility for her life." "That's not fair," my mom snapped. "She's trying. She's been applying to schools, but she needs help to get started. Isn't that what family is for? Isn't it also what parents are for? I countered, my voice sharper than I intended. You've done nothing but support Emily her entire life. I've had to figure everything out on my own, and now you're asking me to sacrifice what I've built because she's trying. No, I'm done. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When my mom finally spoke, her voice was cold. I didn't realize you were so selfish. I laughed bitterly. Selfish? I'm selfish for not bailing out the person who made my life miserable for years? For once, I'm putting myself first, and you can't handle it. That's not selfish, Mom. That's survival. The conversation ended shortly after, and I hung up feeling a mix of anger and relief. I knew I'd done the right thing, but it still hurt to hear my mom dismiss me like that. I wanted to believe they'd back off now, but deep down, I knew better. Sure enough, the next attempt came a few days later, this time from my dad. He called while I was studying, his tone unusually friendly. "Hey, kiddo," he said, like we hadn't had a single tense conversation in years. "How's school?" I wasn't in the mood for small talk, but I played along, answering his questions about my classes and my internship. After a few minutes, he cleared his throat, and I braced myself for the real reason he'd called. "Listen," he started, "I know things have been tense lately, but your mom and I were talking, and we really think it would mean a lot if you could help Emily out. Just a little bit, whatever you can spare." I closed my laptop, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Dad, I've already told Mom and Emily that I'm not doing that. My money is for my future, not to clean up Emily's mess." He sighed heavily, like he was carrying the weight of the world. "I get it, I do. But she's your sister. Don't you want to see her succeed?" "Of course I do," I said, my patience wearing thin. "But I'm not responsible for her success. She's an adult, and it's time she started acting like one." "She's trying," he insisted. "She just needs a little push." I bit back a sharp retort, knowing it would only escalate things. Instead, I said, "If you want to help her, that's your choice. But I'm not getting involved." My dad didn't argue, but the disappointment in his voice was clear when he said goodbye. I knew he'd go straight to my mom, and they'd spend the night lamenting how selfish I was. But I didn't care. For the first time, their opinions didn't matter to me. The final straw came a week later. I got a text from Emily, long, rambling, and full of self-pity. She accused me of abandoning the family, of thinking I was better than everyone else, of being cruel for hoarding my money while she struggled. She even threw in a jab about how my fancy college didn't make me any smarter than her. I didn't reply. There was no point. Instead, I forwarded the text to Ben, one of my closest friends at school, who'd been following the drama with equal parts disbelief and anger. "They're never going to stop," Ben said after reading it. "You might need to block her." I hesitated. Blocking Emily felt so final, like I was cutting off any chance of reconciliation. But as I reread her text, full of venom and entitlement, I realized there was nothing left to salvage. I'd spent years trying to make peace with her, hoping she'd grow up and see me as more than a target. But she never had, and she probably never would. So, I blocked her. The silence that followed was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe. No more texts, no more calls, no more guilt-tripping messages about family. I expected my parents to blow up about it, but they didn't. Maybe they realized I wasn't going to cave this time, or maybe they were just too busy dealing with Emily's tantrums to bother. Either way, I wasn't complaining. Over the next few months, I focused on my future. I graduated with honors, landed a job in my field, and moved into a small but cozy apartment with Nate. Life wasn't perfect. There were still days when I felt the weight of everything I'd been through, but it was mine. I'd built it myself, and that made all the difference. Occasionally, I'd hear updates about my family through my cousins. Emily was still living at home, bouncing between part-time jobs and complaining about how hard her life was. My parents were still enabling her, of course, but even they seemed to be running out of patience. As for me, I finally felt free. I didn't need their approval or validation anymore. For the first time in my life, I was happy, and that was worth everything I'd been through to get there. Months after I blocked Emily, life was finally calm. I focused on work, my friends, and building something meaningful with Nate. My parents had gone unusually quiet. No calls, no attempts to guilt me. At first, I thought it was because they'd finally given up. But deep down, I knew they were just waiting for their next opportunity to pull me back in. It came in the form of a wedding invitation. Not mine, Emily's. One day, I opened my mailbox to find a thick, glittery envelope with Emily's name on it. The invitation was over the top, just like her. Gold foil, embossed lettering, and a location at a high-end venue I knew my parents couldn't afford. I stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether to laugh or roll my eyes. When Nate came home, I handed it to him. He raised an eyebrow as he read it. "Didn't she just text you about how broke she was?" "Yep," I said, grabbing the invitation back. "And now she's planning a wedding that probably costs more than my rent for a year." Classic Emily. Nate smirked. "Are you going?" I didn't even have to think about it. No. I knew my absence would make waves, but I didn't care. After years of being treated like a supporting character in Emily's drama, I wasn't going to play along anymore. I texted my mom to let her know I wouldn't be attending, keeping it short and polite. Her response was immediate. "Please reconsider. This is important for the family." I ignored it. A week later, my dad called. "It's just one day," he said, his tone almost pleading. "You don't have to do anything. Just show up. For us." "For you?" I repeated. "Why? So you can tell everyone how perfect Emily is while pretending I don't exist?" "That's not fair," he said, but the defensiveness in his voice gave him away. "It's completely fair," I shot back. "You've spent my entire life putting Emily first. You can go ahead and keep doing that. I'm not stopping you. But I'm not wasting my time pretending everything's fine." "It's not." The call ended awkwardly, and I didn't hear from them again. The day of the wedding came and went without so much as a text from my parents. I spent it hiking with Nate, enjoying the fresh air and the quiet. It felt like a symbolic break from everything that had weighed me down for so long. I didn't think about Emily or my family once. That evening, my phone lit up with messages from my cousins. They'd gone to the wedding and couldn't wait to spill the details. "It was a disaster," Maddie texted. "You're lucky you missed it." Curiosity got the better of me. "What happened?" I replied. Apparently, Emily's wedding had been as much of a spectacle as I'd expected, but not in the way she'd hoped. The ceremony started late because Emily threw a tantrum about the flowers not being exactly the right shade of blush. The reception was even worse. Her new husband gave a lackluster toast that hinted at second thoughts, and my dad got drunk enough to start ranting about how much everything had cost. But the real kicker came when Emily overheard some guests whispering about how she was living at home and still relying on her parents. According to Maddie, she burst into tears and fled the room, leaving my mom scrambling to do damage control. I laughed out loud when I read the texts. For so long, Emily had been the center of attention, the golden child who could do no wrong. But even she couldn't outrun reality forever. When my mom called a few days later, I let it go to voicemail. She left a long, rambling message about how they missed me and how I should come home soon. I deleted it without listening to the rest. I wasn't angry anymore, not really. I'd moved past the need for their validation or approval. Emily would always be Emily, and my parents would always enable her. But I didn't have to be part of it. I'd built a life outside of their influence, one that was mine and mine alone. Nate and I talked about it that night over dinner. "Do you think they'll ever change?" he asked, pouring me another glass of wine. I shook my head. "No, and that's okay. I don't need them to." He raised his glass. "To cutting ties and building something better." I clinked my glass against his, smiling. "To freedom." And for the first time in my life, I really felt it.